Hi, everyone. Feels a little silly to use a microphone this close and personal, but then you can all hear me. Hi and welcome. My name is Amy Andrews, and I'm the children's book buyer here at East City. We're so glad you all are here today. Thanks for coming in person or tuning in on the live stream if you're tuning in that way. We have a lot of events and book clubs here at East City, including a couple book clubs for young readers. We have a book club, our Page Turners, for readers ages 8 to 11, and our Between Reads book club for readers ages 11 to 13, as well as a teen art club for readers ages 12 and up who get special early access to upcoming young adult titles. If any of that sounds interesting to you, please talk to me or anyone on staff or go on our website for more info. We're also hosting another great young adult event 2 weeks from today. We have Alana Bennett with her debut young adult novel, The Education of Kia Greer, in conversation with Linda Holmes, in store on Wednesday, May 14th. Couple quick housekeeping things. If you need a bathroom, it's upstairs, back past the registers. If you're watching on Zoom and you have any technical difficulties, let us know in the chat. My colleague Maggie is monitoring that. And number 3, we will have time for questions tonight. So please, if you're watching on Zoom, put those questions in the Q&A feature. And if you're here in person, we'll take those at the appropriate time. And finally, and most importantly, if you need to purchase any books tonight, they are all upstairs at the register, and you can do that after the event. So for our panel tonight, it is, putting it mildly, an interesting time to be living in our nation's capital. Today's panelists all have new books set in DC at different time periods, from the War of 1812 to World War I to the 1970s, all other times of great upheaval and uncertainty. And they all feature protagonists who are standing up for what's right, using their voices to make a difference, no matter how old they are, which I think is really inspiring and hopeful for young readers today. We are lucky to have such a great literary community of Kidlit authors here in the district, and we're really excited to hear from these authors tonight. Quick bios for them. First up, Marcie Flinchum Atkins is a teacher librarian by day and a children's book writer in the wee hours of the morning. She has an MFA and an MA in children's literature from Hollins University. Is the author of, among other titles, Wait, Rest, Pause, Dormancy in Nature, which was one of Kirkus's best picture books of the year. Her debut YA novel, One Step Forward, came out in 2025, and her next nonfiction picture book, When Twilight Comes, is forthcoming from Chronicle in 2026. L.M. Elliott was an award-winning magazine journalist in Washington, D.C. before becoming a New York Times bestselling author of historical and biographical young adult novels. Her works include Under a War-Torn Sky, Suspect Red, Hamilton, and Peggy. Uh, Walls and Bee and the New Deal Horse have won the Scott Odell, the VLA Cardinal Cup, and the Grateful American Book Prize for Historical Fiction, and have been named NCSS CBC Notables, Bank Street College of Education Bests, and Kirkus Bests. Sean O'Brien is a former White House speechwriter who teaches at Georgetown University. He served as director of speechwriting to Vice President Joe Biden and Dr. Jill Biden, and special assistant to President Barack Obama. White House Clubhouse was his debut novel and is followed by its sequel, White House on Fire. And our moderator tonight is John Cochran, who grew up in Kansas City, Missouri. Breaking into Sunlight, his first novel, was named one of 2024's best books for kids by the New York Public Library and one of the best debuts by the American Booksellers Association. And now, after that very long intro, please welcome our panelists. Woo!
Well, thank you for coming, and thanks to everybody online as well. And thank you to Amy and East City Bookshop for making space for these kind of events. I know we're all really grateful for what you guys do to connect readers with books and support our books. So do you guys want to get underway by just briefly describing your books and talking about them? Sean, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start out. So I wrote the White House Clubhouse series. So the first book, there's two presidential children, and they find a hidden clubhouse that connects them with every other kid who's ever lived in the White House. So the first book, they go back to Teddy Roosevelt's time, and they hang out with his 6 kids and 20 pets. And that's White House Clubhouse. But the second book, which is also out, is called White House on Fire, which takes them back to the time of the War of 1812. And the third book, which is coming out in October, will take them back to the Great Depression.
Okay, mine's complicated enough that I'm going with notes, you all, because we've got 3 of us here, and John should talk about his book too. So I'm going to be fast. So Truth Lies in the Questions in Between. It's my 14th novel, my 3rd Cold War docudrama, the first on McCarthyism, the second on 1961 Berlin, when the wall went up. It's set in 1973, the year of Watergate, Roe, the struggle to ratify the ERA, and Vietnam vets coming back to the United States. It's the year Congress, the president, and the courts get into a then unprecedented checks and balances slugfest, when women have constitutional equality within our reach to have it unraveled by other women, when Americans' willingness to face hard questions and recognize lies or not kind of defines everything that comes in the next years. The Watergate scandal lasted, from quick history lesson, it lasts from June 1972 through August 74, when Nixon actually resigns under pressure from fellow Republicans. I zoom in on 1973 because that's the year the Senate hearings kind of reveal one stunning thing after another about the Nixon and the break-in. It's also the year ratification of the ERA was supposed to be quick, but it was derailed by suburban homemakers, mostly affluent, women who'd felt put down by libbers, marshaled by conservative author Phyllis Schlafly, we can talk about more later if you want, who tapped into those resentments and then scared the bejeebies out of them, telling them that they would no longer be allowed to be stay-at-home moms. 1973 was also only the second year that young women were allowed to be Capitol Hill pages. So thank God, because that allowed me to tell this story through a Senate page who could actually be witnessing all these events. So I could do it authentically, right? It is a fiction nonfiction hybrid if you all are interested in history, and I hope everybody is since you're here. It does have a photo essay that punctuates the books, the narrative, that are the factual events of each month's time, so that you can actually look at all those headlines and quotes and photos yourself. And it had two characters. The main one is Patty. And all these three Cold War books, they all have characters who are on the opposite ends of the political spectrum, learning to trust one another, getting over the biases that their parents and the national milieu has kind of forced upon them. It's Patty, who is a moderate Republican, who's going to be the main protagonist. She is easily shocked, a political wife wannabe from the Midwest, whose foil is Simone, who is a voracious reader, musician, ardent feminist whose parents couldn't control what her thoughts would have came out of her mouth if they tried. So anyway.
And I'm Marcie Atkins. My book is One Step Forward. It's about the youngest suffragist to be imprisoned at Occoquan for fighting for the right to vote. And so she was one of the young teens that was, she was protesting near the White House. The suffragists were some of the first to protest in front of the White House, and they had swift and very punishing consequences for doing that. And some of them, they were housed in DC district jail, but then also sent to Occoquan. So it's told from the point of view of Matilda Young, who the story takes place, she started 13, and then it goes from 1913 to 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed. It's told in verse, so it's an entire thing is a novel in verse, historical fiction. So DC history connected.
Yeah, and they're all terrific books, and they're historical fiction. They're also very political books. And so I think the first thing I was hoping we could talk about is why write historical fiction for young people, and has your thinking about the relevance of your book, is it different now than when you first sat down to write, given recent political events? These are not didactic books at all, but I was hit repeatedly by parallels. So I would love to hear you guys talk a little bit about that aspect.
Well, I'll say the thing that drew me to history has always been the stories. I mean, yes, there's always going to be parallels. There's always going to be things that, you need to know about in order to deal with the future or anything like that. But honestly, if you just dig into even the story about one city block versus another, there's always something amazing that happened there that you don't hear about. So, we end up going on vacations, we start geeking out on just even the history of wherever we are, because it gives you a little sense of place on it. And then, if you find good stories, then that makes good fiction too. So,
well, we might get into this later, but your character, the real life character, Mordecai
Booth. Yeah, isn't that a cool name?
His wagon full of, I did not know him, and he was just a terrific story, and
yeah,
plays a kind of an important part in the story, kind of a fairly minor appearance in the.
It's a minor appearance in the story, but it also he was the one who rescued the powder that in the War of 1812, when the British were marching in, they burned the Capitol, they burned the White House, but it was a U.S. government employee that burned the Navy Yard to protect it. And first he got all of the powder out in a town that had no wagons left available. He went and requisitioned whichever ones he could. This 50-year-old clerk, and he's the reason that the country still had powder at the end. And so, yeah, that's exactly the type of story that you end up stumbling on. And it doesn't hurt that his name is just really cool.
Great.
Laura, do you want to?
Well, history is the best, you guys, right? It's a human drama. It's the story of how we've come to be who we are today, and why we are, and how we are. And you think about it with historical fiction. I love going into schools and talking to kids, because the thing about historical fiction, and these two authors, and John too, although he hasn't done historical fiction yet, right? Okay. But will, because it's the best. The kids they have to learn all these dates, statistics, yada, 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 that they had to regurgitate back for all their standardized tests. But the great thing about historical fiction is that you give them a protagonist that hopefully that they're going to care about to walk that journey with them. You know, history, I always say to kids too, is history is crises and conflicts and groundswells of thought and cultural change that have been imposed on us from leaders and, you know, and people in power. And we're the people who actually have to go through it and live it. So historical fiction can take a big issue in a big time period, like I can take Watergate, but I will tell it through my protagonist, Patty, who suddenly has this, you know, she is a moderate Republican. She is a big, but her father is a Midwest fundraiser for Nixon's campaign. And she comes into Washington very idealistic and really believing in Nixon. And like the country, she has to learn to question everything that she's thought before about her parents and politics, her boyfriend, who she wants to be as a woman because of the feminist movement going on. So I'm hoping that you go through those struggles with her and you'll feel them that way. And that way you'll really know what that historical time period was all about and what it took from us, you know, ordinary people, the kind of courage or not, integrity or not, compassion or not, those things that have allowed us to move forward.
I think one of the things that you show in all three of your Cold War books, so Suspect Red, Walls, and Truth Lies, are, and you mentioned it in your intro a little bit, the idea of kids coming together from different ideological and political viewpoints. I mean, which is, and finding connecting points, finding ways to work together. I mean, that's something that we really need to see modeled today.
Yes, I hope so. And I hope these books are helpful in that way. With Truth Lies, it was very much not just the political leanings, because actually all my characters are sort of Republicans and moderates, because that's the way it was back then, you all, you know, everybody, 83% of Americans, for instance, thought that we should have the ERA. It was that in the Senate passed it 84-8, bipartisan. Republicans supported it too. You all know who Strom Thurmond is? Even Strom Thurmond supported it, y'all. I mean, that's how pervasive. And, you know, there was much more of a middle lane allowed at that time. And I think our kids in particular, that I say, you all have to deal with a lot of nonsense that we adults throw down at you. There's this trickle down impact of polarization and inflammatory language and hate labels that affect you all while you're trying to decide who you want to be and what you want to believe in and what you can trust. And so it became really important to me to try to show with these pivotal moments in time, McCarthyism, which has such relevance with today as well, too, that we can talk about if you want. The Berlin Wall, which I found that most people didn't know why NATO existed. And so I tell why through the Berlin Wall. And two cousins, one who's a East German, raised, inculcated an anti-American dogma. I mean, really, at one point he finally jokes about, well, I don't see a devil's tail on you, actually, you know, because that's what he'd been told. And then with Truth Lies, the idea that to move forward, these two young women really have to come to trust one another in moments of crisis. And for Patty in particular, to learn to shed some of the cultural messaging that's being dumped on her about, at that point, women should be diffident and acquiescing and, you know, very going along with parental opinions or boyfriends' ambitions and dreams and desires. And it was really important, I think, to be able to show rather than tell how young people can, you know, find their way if they just get rid of all this stuff that we're telling them.
And Marcie, we were talking before we came in about, I think you said you didn't really expect that your book would be as topical as it is.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
You know, so I started working on this book in 2017, and you know, I was mostly just interested in like, wow, I didn't know that women were put in jail for fighting for the right to vote. Like, I didn't know that, and then I'd only been here for about at that point 2 years, and so it was sort of a shock to me. And I approached it as like, as I write a lot of nonfiction, I love to research, I love to read, so I was just like, I'm going to learn more about this, and then, you know, I was hoping that maybe the book could come out in 2020 because it was the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and we all know 2020 things, shut down. And I was actually really grateful that the book didn't come out in 2020 because it's very hard to launch a book during that time. And at that, I had started with the book is told from Matilda Young's point of view. It's a singular protagonist point of view, first person. But at the time, I really thought I wanted to tell from multiple points of view, multiple suffragists. And so I thought, I just took me some time to get to where I wanted to be. So when the book was supposed to come out in 2025 and, lots of things are happening with women's rights now. And I really, like, it was not intentional. And I was not my hope. It was my hope for it to be historical fiction and that we could look back on all the things that had happened and not to be like, wow, we're still having to try to protect the rights that we have. So yeah, I did not at all. I did not approach this historical fiction thinking like, wow, there's all these connections to today because I didn't see into 2025 when I wrote the book. But as far as historical fiction, I mean, I actually had intended to write this book as a nonfiction book originally. And I realized that once I found who my character was, I didn't know enough. There was not enough in the historical record for me to just do it completely as a biography. So there were about some of the other suffragists. I could have written a biography about Alice Paul or Lucy Burns. There's enough there for me to do that. But for Matilda Young, because it was for teens, I really wanted to do it from a teen perspective. And so I realized in order really to get into her head and really do the emotions I need to do, it's going to have to be historical fiction. And I hoped that, it was a time period I didn't know a lot about, really growing up. I had heard of Susan B. Anthony when I was, the age of you all that are in this room. And I did not know about some of these women. And so I had hoped to bring it to an audience that may not know some of the people in such a way.
Well, and I didn't know a lot of these details. These women were arrested in front of the White House.
Yeah.
For exercising their free speech rights because it was a time of war, right?
Yeah.
That they were considered treasonous. This
Yes.
language was treasonous.
Yes, the language, and they were using the president's own words against him.
Yeah.
They actually put his words on on banners and things. And they were arrested in front of the White House. They were, at some points they went to Lafayette Square, which is right across the street, and then they also went to the Capitol building. Matilda was also arrested there as well. And so they were multiple places, but the main place was right in front of the White House gates.
And terribly abused as well.
Oh yes, absolutely. And in the part of the book where in 1917, the Night of Terror in Occoquan workhouse, and the museum is there if you've ever been there. During 2020, like right before everything shut down in this country, they opened up the Lucy Burns Museum at Occoquan Workhouse, and they had a museum there before, but it was across the way a little bit, and it was. This is really like a really well done museum. So but they had sort of, cobbled together a few things and was really lovely. And I learned a ton. That's where I actually wrote the book from what I knew from there. But now it's a nice new museum. But, there was a lot that I didn't know and that I learned from all these local resources.
Well, so you mentioned your character was the youngest
that we know
person arrested during these protests
that we know of. Yeah. That I have been able to find in the records. So she was 19 when she was imprisoned at Occoquan. Many of the women were much older. In fact, one of the things at the Night of Terror in 1917 is that some of the women were much older and they were being flung and, one of them, they thought they had a heart attack and one of them, they thought they was dead. And so, she was the youngest and she's screaming like for help. And they kept saying, she's so young, let her go home to her mom. And, but yeah, she was the youngest that I was able to find.
And so as a segue into the next question, maybe I could put this to you first. All of you guys in your books show young people pushing back on adults and authority figures, questioning authority figures. One of the sisters in Sean's book says, grown-ups don't know everything, right?
Right,
Very flatly. And, Matilda faces interesting from a couple of different directions.
Yeah.
A mom that thinks she's moving too radical a way, and a dad who's uncomfortable about her putting her son, I think, uncomfortable with the idea of change. So why is it important to show that, and how do you handle that for your audience?
So in some ways, I try to use what I knew from history, and that there was a rift between the National Women's Party, which was Alice Paul's connection, and then the National Association of Women's Suffrage Association. I know I messed that up, but those women, NASA is the abbreviation. They wanted to go state by state. We're just going to go state by state and try to get this amendment through. And the National Women's Party was like, no, we're gonna get the amendment, and we're gonna do this for the whole country. And so that was interesting. And so I felt like her mother probably would have been part of NASA, and maybe her sister, we know for sure that Matilda's sister and Matilda herself were part of the National Women's Party. And so I thought, let's have this sort of, three women really, who really wanted women's rights, but they wanted it in different ways, because that was true to what was actually happening. The dad, we know from census records that he worked for the Census Bureau in DC, and many men, not all, but many men were, anti-suffragist. And so I thought, let's have dad sort of, and I physically separated them actually in the text. So in the verse, when the dad and the brother who are anti-suffrage in the beginning, they're physically removed on the page from Matilda, and then as they start to, realize, okay, this is going to happen whether we want it to or not. And they start to come around into a form of acceptance. The white space closes up. And so the dad is never really, he loves his kids, but he's sort of like, we disagree on this matter. And I do disagree with my wife as well. And so I tried to piece it together. I don't know if the dad actually was, anti-suffrage, but many men at that time were. And so I thought it seemed feasible, seemed plausible that that would be the case.
The dad in Laura, in your book, is a darker figure for sure. I mean, you're writing for a somewhat older audience. You really show, I think, well, that period in a young person's life where they are encountering the world and realizing that what they have been programmed or what they've been fed is perhaps not what they think. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you approach that with Patty.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for picking up on that. And it was a really important thread in the book. Part of what I do a lot of in this book, there are a lot of parallels. There are a lot of mirrored relationships and character arc growths. In some ways, Patty's coming to recognize the gaslighting that her father is capable of. He's a truly brilliant psychiatrist, overbearing, and a lot of charisma, just commands a room when he walks into it. And he has just dominated his wife, not necessarily, well, through psychological control, which was typical of the 1970s in many ways. And I should back up and say, when I was a writer with the Washingtonian magazine, which I did for 20 years, I wrote a lot about women's issues, and I wrote a lot about psychological topics. And I actually am old enough that I wrote about a white collar domestic violence case back when nobody believed that happened. This is pre-O.J. Simpson. I was a baby. I was 26, I think, when I wrote that. But that idea of controlling others is something that I've wrote a lot about and have always had concerns about, especially for our young people coming to learn finding their own voice and finding their own agency. And certainly, when I said that I had a lot of parallels and mirror relationships in this, Patty coming to recognize that about her father is an echo, almost a symbol of some ways of the country, coming to recognize the kind of disinformation that was being fed them constantly until people began actually braving speaking truth to power during those Senate hearings. So there's that part of it. I also I am a big believer in youth and how smart they are. And when I left the magazine, I fully planned to go back to the magazine when I did my first novel. It was just an offshoot of one of my articles. It's the Under a War-Torn Sky, about a World War II pilot. But I really loved writing. So sometimes my peers will say, why are you writing novels, for one thing? And why are you writing for teenagers? Like, oh my God, because they have this righteous indignation and their moral compass is so strong still. And I love activating that and encouraging that, because you guys know better than we do often. We have contextualized and excused and been inculcated to think about, well, we do this because of that. And we're trying, but we can't really. Kids, you guys see straight through that kind of stuff. With Patty, she had a bigger battle to go through because, of course, her boyfriend is very like that as well. And it was such of the time, you all. I was a young teenager in during Watergate. I grew up in this area. And I had forgotten until I did that deep dive back into 1970s, the way people talked about and to women. And I had a whole page here about the actual echoes going on right now that I will only do if I know that it's politically okay with you guys. But let's just say that there is a resurgence of expecting women to obey, and I've been distressed by that. So I hope Patty can encourage young women to, think for themselves and to be strong enough to think for themselves and to know that they're going to have support for that. That's a long answer to your question.
No,
Sorry.
yeah. And Sean, I was thinking about your book a couple of days ago when I was talking to my daughter who's 19, and she was talking about how her generation feels very hopeless about the ability to make any change, and it seems so large. And I was thinking about the White House Clubhouse pledge, right, which is I promise to help because I can.
Because I can.
And
yeah,
you really,
you're
in
a
both
position.
books, I mean, you really show kids seeing, stepping up and engaging. I mean, in the first book, engaging with, politics is a constructive kind of force, making change, and then just getting into the fight in White House on Fire.
Yeah. I think, one of those things about, and I've thought about this in my own career, and I know a lot of people, in this town do. It's a matter of, did I use the spots where I was effectively? What did I actually do things? I mean, you were at a magazine, what did you do at that time? What did the people that we all worked for use? Limited time, you stick around long enough and you find out that somebody who is very powerful for a moment then basically has no power right afterwards. And that's not even a matter of them leaving office. Sometimes it's a matter of they have the votes or they don't. And so what did you do in that second? And I think kids, it's important for them to be able to decide kind of, well, what do you actually have power over right now? Do you have the power to say something nice to someone when you could say something mean, right? Do you have the power to intervene in some kind of a bullying situation or something like that? And so, using these different characters and just kind of putting them into these historical moments, it actually ended up taking me through a couple different drafts where I would write arguments that didn't make it into the last thing. I had Marissa berating James Madison about slavery. And my editor is like, that is not for either the character or for you to be doing. And she's right. But I will say on the other, the way you talked me down off the ledge on that is you've done a good job of actually creating other characters or giving some voice to these real characters. Paul Jennings, who was James Madison's valet, he was not there voluntarily, but he was a White House kid. He was there as 12 years old. And then he would go on to be a free black man in DC, one of the leaders of the community, and write the first White House memoir. And so, okay, what did you do with your time? And he did something very effective that ended up kind of lasting. So I think that would be the main thing that I would want kids to kind of take away, and grownups, anybody reading it.
Add one thing just quickly to encourage you guys, what you might be able to do in Suspect Red, which is the McCarthyism book. I was absolutely delighted to find it opens with my character, who's a bookish kid who loves to read, his mother yanking Robin Hood away from him because Robin Hood had been banned, you guys. Oh, wow. He took from the rich, gave to the poor. That's a communist philosophy. It's advocating lawlessness, to poison kids' minds. Well, that was the final straw for some Indiana University co-eds, that they were banning Robin Hood. So they left campus, went to surrounding farms, got burlap bags full of feathers, brought them back to campus, dyed them green in their dorm room tubs, and went out and started passing them out as kind of this really witty commentary against, you really going to ban Robin Hood? Wow. And it spawned Merry Men marches across the nation to Stanford and Harvard. And a lot of historians actually credit those 5 Indiana University students who stood up to the open FBI files on them. They were blasted as radical, long-hair, pinko communists, and they kept at it. They were moderate kids. They were in a church group. And they think that those kids actually spawned the campus activism that became so important
Wow.
to the civil rights movement. So see what you guys can do.
Yeah, it's a good story. Well, and all three of these books I think are really inspiring, I think, for young people, because they're all showing people who, even though they're afraid sometimes and they're facing, a lot of pushback from grown-ups, stepping up and doing what needs to be done. One of the things, and I want to just check the time to be sure, because I have one last question, but I wanted to, before I went off on a tangent. One of the things that you all show is cross-generational alliances too. So you've got the older suffragettes who are stepping up to be more radical than Matilda's mom would like, and then you have Patty and her mom, and Patty and Simone's mom, and then you've got the kids pitching in to help, the likes of Mordecai Booth and
Sure, yeah.
And I think that's a powerful thing to do. And I don't know if there's something we could talk about in that, the importance of that in this day and
Well,
age.
I would say, and I'm hearing all of us saying, well, and it's important for young people to do it. Well, it's important for all of us.
Right.
That's right. And, I think one of the things, generational, labels kind of give me hives because, like, it's this idea that I have watched my generation be awesome and horrible and very severe, and I'm watching every other generation do exactly the same thing, to the point where it's okay, yeah, that you get a different perspective at different ages in your life, but also, you are going to have opinions. And I do think that you have a responsibility, to help out people who are younger. And people who think of themselves as younger. There are people younger still. My niece was talking about, helping out the little kids in the school, and she's a third grader. I'm like, okay, that's cool. That you are not the little kids, the other kids are little. That's cool.
Well, and actually that I could make my pitch quickly here. All of these books, I occasionally run into grown-ups who say, well, I don't read young adult, or I don't read, but these are awesome books for all ages to read. And I got a lot out of all these books. I learned a lot I didn't know, in all three. So
Your book is awesome too, John.
Thank you.
Here. Breaking into Sunlight is an amazing book.
So one of the last thing I want to talk about a little bit is for me, one of the added pleasures of this book was reading stories that are set in DC and DC, the places I know really well. And I told Laura, maybe for people who are not from the neighborhood who are online, there's a restaurant a couple of blocks up from us called Mr. Henry's. And I can't walk by Mr. Henry's without thinking of a very dramatic scene in Laura's book. A fight, I don't think it's a spoiler, a fight that breaks out in Mr. Henry's and spills out into the street right before Roberta Flack shows up, I think, right? So
Wow.
which is, it's cool. So but there's also maybe a sort of a deeper side of to get your guys' thoughts on the role of DC and the people who live and work here in the history that you're tapping into and the stories you're tapping into. And that particularly struck me at a time when DC, and by some folks, is being vilified. The federal workers are being vilified. And then we see the likes of Mordecai Booth and, Matilda's a DC resident. You have Simone's dad, the federal worker, who takes a stand. So I wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about, in your stories, DC and as the importance of history in these historical events.
Well, I'll plunge in on Simone's dad just because he works, he was a prosecutor for the IRS. And again, talking about, I didn't necessarily anticipate just how irrelevant it would be to stuff that's going on today, because he learns during one of the Senate hearing testimonies, the one that really broke everything open in Watergate was John Dean. By the way, on my website, I interviewed John Dean.
Oh, wow.
And I taped him. And if you want to hear him talk, he was, yeah, I should have. That's a good question. For those of you who don't know, John Dean was a young 34-year-old White House counselor to Nixon. And he's making a joke because, of course, Nixon was taping people secretly, which became his undoing. But John Dean people were just riveted to his testimony for 5 days. And one of the things that he revealed was that there was an enemies list, a memo that specifically said, how can we use the machinery of the federal government to, excuse me, quote, screw our enemies? Okay. My father, Simone's dad, who's a very ethical guy, hears that. Then hears that one of the people that was an actual enemies list that they had written down, from fundraisers and Democrats to the one woman on it was Mary McGrory, who was a Washington Star columnist who I remember reading. She was great, you guys. And she had been audited by the FBI, audited by the IRS rather egregiously. And even going after her donations to the Catholic Church for Christmas presents or something for a local orphanage. And my guy resigns. He also is going to, again, he replicates something called the Saturday Night Massacre, which is Nixon did not like the fact that he was being investigated. So he wanted to get rid of a special prosecutor. Are you guys following me here? It's called Saturday Night Massacre because he tells the attorney general to fire the special prosecutor. The attorney general refuses and quits in protest against this illegal order. Nixon goes after and wants the assistant AG to do the same. He refuses. He's fired. Finally, the third guy fires the special prosecutor. And again, I'm spending so much time talking to people that they're looking at me like, okay, what can we do if we disagree with things that are going on right now? The outrage over what happened on that weekend was so enormous that telegrams came rolling in from all over the country, so much so that it jammed the Western Union offices here. And there were mail bags crammed full of so many telegrams that people couldn't get into their congressional offices. And people surrounded the White House with signs saying honk for impeachment. And traffic just stopped dead on Pennsylvania Avenue with this cacophony. And Nixon relented and but he had also seized all the records in the special prosecutor's office after he was fired. But given that outrage nationally by all these Americans, he had to relent and he hired a new special prosecutor. So yeah. So federal workers, you guys, like my fictitious but based on real life people who, stood up for what he believed was right. We are really, really lucky, you all, to have civil servants who dedicate their lives to whatever, office that they are working in. And another thing that I saw in doing all the reading that I did was all the questions that the senators asked at the Watergate hearings. They were generated by little researchers, young researchers in the back, including Hillary Clinton. Who was, they were coming up with all these questions. So, we don't see all these people who actually keep our government functioning, but they're so involved in what the chairman of the Watergate Senate Investigation Committee said, that these hearings, when he gavelled it in, are instigated to try to govern ourselves with ethically and with moral justness.
Well, and I was interested also to read that, Matilda is a DC resident, the main character of your book, Marcie, and didn't get the right to vote for president until 64. But they're really here on the front lines. And that was fascinating for me to read. They were at the White House every day.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to, one of the things I think is interesting is that, to fight for the right to vote, but then you actually don't get it yourself. And then and she didn't. And when I looked, I did look for her voting record because I thought she was still alive, of course, when DC residents were allowed to vote for president. But I thought she had to have been there. Of course, she was there. She lived here as an adult. There was a short stint in Europe that she did, but she was one of the founding members of the Children's Book Guild, which is still in operation. It's still an organization that's is very much operating today. And she was involved in founding a children's museum here in DC, not the one that's currently, I did ask if there was a connection. It's not the same one that is currently operational, but she was very much a DC resident and stayed here despite the fact that she fought really hard for others to get the right to vote, but she didn't for a while. But it's interesting, the story starts with the 1913 Women's March, the day before President Wilson is inaugurated, and so I actually took a tour down Pennsylvania Avenue and walked that whole entire way that the women would have walked. And then I also went to where Matilda's family would have lived, sort of over in Adams Morgan, and took the walk to her high school. She was a Central High School graduate, which I know has changed names, but I wanted to sort of be in that space that she would have been in, and walked to the White House and to Lafayette Square, where she would have also spent a lot of her time, and where the National Women's Party actually had their headquarters was on Lafayette Square for a time, and then they moved on back, up here on the hill near Springport. But for the time that she was there, really active, that was at Lafayette Square too.
So what do you think motivated DC residents to, like her, to step up? I mean, was it clear to them that they weren't going to get?
I don't know. I don't. That's a great question. I don't know if it was. I don't think. I mean, well, I wonder if they. It's a great question, because they thought even the men couldn't vote at the time, right? So the brother even at one point says, and he's like, well, I mean, you could move to out west because some of the women are able to vote out there, but he knew that the men. Why are you going to fight? Fighting for this right to vote? I can't even vote. The brother and the dad. So.
Well, and Sean, you mentioned the Marines, right, at Barracks. So I'm trying to think of some of the other DC figures that factor into White House on Fire. I mean, the Marines.
Yeah.
There's Mordecai Booth,
Paul Jennings, because later in his life, he's working at the patent office, right? So he becomes a federal employee himself, right? And, there's just all these different amazing figures that you learn about who are just doing their jobs, various different, like some doing it well, some doing it poorly, and when I fictionalize them, some I actually make look better than they were. Like Teddy Roosevelt and Alice Roosevelt are two incredible figures who did incredible things and were also pretty awful at some other points, but I make them look pretty good. I utterly slander William Loeb, who was the chief of staff for the White House, and to my knowledge was not a bad guy at all, but I needed a bad guy for my book, right? So it is fiction, but so is Hamilton, and it's what's going to get you interested in the personalities, and then you learn the real stuff, and you get to walk the paths. I mean, I want to do that walk now. What you're talking about. So yeah, it comes down to the stories and the interest that it generates, and that's what brings you back to real life.
Yeah, and Mordecai Booth is a really inspiring figure if you're thinking about the way federal workers are being treated, because it's just like, nobody was doing this, so I did it. And, I'm here, I'm on the job.
Exactly.
I requisitioned the wagon, and, it was, it's.
And now he's got a bar named after him.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
Well, we can't go to it because it's behind the Navy.
It's in the Navy.
Yeah.
Mordecai Booth. Yeah. So should we open up to questions, if y'all, and I think what I'm going to do for the online folks is I'll repeat from the audience, I'll repeat the questions, and I guess you'll read some questions from the viewers at home. I guess that's okay. Anybody have any questions for these guys? Sure.
Are there any other historical fiction authors for kids, or specific titles that you were inspired by when writing your book?
So should I repeat that? The question is, are there other writers of historical fictions for kids that you all have been or are inspired by that you would recommend?
All of them. I don't know. There are series that you really get into, and I got into through my kids, but like the I Survived series and Dear America and everything. But then there's other things that I ended up learning about, history outside the U.S. that I wouldn't have known about, like a book called Making Bombs for Hitler, which is very grim title, but it's about Ukrainian kids, and I didn't realize that they were caught in between Soviets and the Nazis, and they were fighting a two-front war of their own that we haven't heard about. So. I think it's cool for kids to be able to chase down whatever is interesting. The Nathan Hale's, true stories, because I meet a lot of kids who are really into graphic novels. Which, well, hey, if you do it, there's a great one by John Lewis here, so yeah. So yeah. Yep.
I'll throw out some names for you really fast if you guys are writing down names, but following on the Ukraine thing, Amanda McCrinna is a newish author, but she's extraordinary. These are all kind of World War II titles, but Amanda McCrinna, Sharon Cameron, who is phenomenal, Ruta Sepetys, there's one other person on it, Monica Hess, who's actually a columnist for the Washington Post as well. So,
And does Monica write for kids as well, young people, or is it?
well, these are all YA novels. that I
YA,
just rattled
okay,
off for
okay.
you. So, and like mine, are also adult crossovers. So.
Kip will great historical fiction writer. All of her books are novels in verse as well. So I highly recommend her. Deborah Wiles is she does middle grade and like some YA historical fiction. And similar to what Laura has done is she has a 60s trilogy that has some documentary kind of photos and some information and then historical fiction. So that's a great series if you're really into that type of writing as well.
Any? Yep.
Great conversation. Thanks. I think one of the weird things about living on Capitol Hill is that people who don't live on Capitol Hill think that your life is sort of like entirely suffused with world historical events. When generally speaking, just like make breakfast or go to school. But I guess that challenge is the same for you guys writing historical fiction about DC. So how do you make sure that your protagonists are also living their lives as kids and not just sort of overdetermined by historical?
Question is, how do these writers portray kids just living as kids, even though they're in DC, which is at the center of world events?
I would say that a lot of it is a matter of, like starting with what a kid's day is like and, dealing with teachers, dealing with parents, dealing with restrictions and everything. And oh, by the way, you're thrown into this situation, whether it's in my case, their mom gets elected president, so they have to move into this house where they're being watched all the time. But the characters that you guys are talking about is fascinating. Like, that you have a character who just decides that she can't stay quiet, right? And the same, and so having to live in a situation where you don't have the option of just continuing to do daily life, and yet daily life continues. It's really tough.
Yeah, keeping to the scene about Mr. Henry's that you were talking about, that's, I won't go into it a lot, but it's basically when you're writing about these historical events, you also have to, I try to think about, okay, how did that spill into these kids' day-to-day lives and their relationship with their friends and the boy that they're falling in love with. And, there's one of the minor characters that I really loved writing is boy from North Carolina, whose brothers are all fighting in Vietnam, and one comes back, and he's come to DC to go to Nixon held a big bash at the White House. So I have that event for returning vets and one guest, and the page Will brings his brother to Mr. Henry's because they want to hear Roberta Flack. One of them's having a birthday and they want to hear Roberta Flack. And he's 18 and oh my gosh, he makes a boo-boo because drinking was okay at 18. So he has one beer and then another, and then he's like, not handling it well. And then there are people who, we were not good to our Vietnam vets when they came home. And the vet is is traumatized by having been a POW, and it kind of goes from there. So the thing is that, there was an event, and then it should just kind of be the ripple out for how it would be a day to day, because it is important to show that people who live here on Capitol Hill and work maybe in the Capitol or the White House are actually real life people, who have kids and toothaches and,
And
homework.
there's a fun scene in your book where they're at Patty's boarding house on the Hill, and they're watching a tennis match with Billie Jean King and the chauvinist
Bobby Riggs.
Bobby Riggs, right? Sorry,
Claimed male.
the battle of the sexes, and that's where one of the good guys, one of the men who is really a model for how to be a good man, right?
Yes.
Is there. And how about you, Marcie, with your?
Yeah, I mean, so I did a lot of thinking, like she probably did a lot of walking. And so I did have there was talk about school and how she skipped school to go to this suffrage parade. But also I gave her a neighbor that was a boy the term suffragist was meant to be for women or for men who were also pro-suffrage. And so he's a suffragist and he's a Boy Scout, and the Boy Scouts did actually go to help at the parade. And so I sort of have this, connection to the Boy Scouts and also to this neighbor that she has, just an everyday person. And he like helps her collect things, and she collects like little, memorabilia, because I thought, later in her life, she's like this museum curator. So she had to have been interested in things, right? And so she collects the buttons and she collects the sash and like different things. And he hands her some different things as well for her to collect. So I did have her have a friend like that. But also there's some poems throughout that are sort of interstitials throughout the book where she's reflective about what's happening with her, and they're walking poems. And so the poems are like one word per line. And my intention with that was to have it be like sort of like the clop, clop, clop of you walking around and try to, contemplating what you're thinking about. And so they did have trolleys at the time, but she was doing a lot of walking. And so, walking from place to place. And that's sort of how she processed things. But
I want to read all your books. Hey, I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you went about researching and getting historical details or finding interesting archival sources. What your process is and how you do that.
So the question is about the process of researching the books and the materials that you all used.
I would say going down rabbit holes is, you start out thinking that you're looking for one thing, but then you find out that, oh, well, this other thing sounds pretty interesting. Just like, would Teddy Roosevelt have left out of Union Station? Well, actually, he would have left out of the one 4 blocks away, but the place was being built under his direction. And then blah, 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 blah. Suddenly I've lost 4 hours reading about John Warner turning it into a bicentennial museum. And so as far as characters go, I would always center myself around White House kids to get to your point about like living a normal life. Like all of these kids had to go to school and they had to, and so then you find out just details about them. And in some really exciting times, you get to get their own writing stuff in their own words. Alice Roosevelt, Paul Jennings, all these different people, they wrote about it later on. Now that's an adult giving perspective back, but then you can kind of use that to extrapolate how would a kid talk.
I'm looking really fast for one thing here to show you, but I think listening to all of us, we all have our own, methodology, but I can tell I'm an obsessive researcher, and it's from having been a reporter for so many years. And I don't write a word until I've done massive amount of research. I can tell you guys pretty much do the same thing. And research tells me what to write. For instance, honestly, I was really struggling with when my editor, Elise Howard, thank you, Elise, suggested that I follow up the Berlin piece with the Watergate one. Thought, great. And then she said, oh, hey, I just saw this series, Mrs. America, with Kate Blanchett as Phyllis Schlafly. It's really hard to watch, you all. You should write about the ERA too. And I'm thinking, oh, great. Okay. How in the world would I do both things without it seeming forced or contrived? And I kept reading and I kept reading. And that's when I found that, oh, there were female pages only the second year. There only like 4 of them, so that she could be emblematic. She could witness all this stuff.
Right.
So it's legitimate. She's carrying notes. She's hearing, she's going to be carrying something in and hear John Dean say something that makes her think, oh my God, has my father gotten involved in that? To also, she is emblematic of women's lib. She's one of only, a handful out of 100 some kids, boys. And, it was a way that she could be this linchpin legitimately. The other thing I did is I do a lot of interviewing of people. You all may do. I don't know if you know who Jill Ruckelshaus is, but she was this amazing, I can't believe I didn't know about her before, but she was they called her the Republican answer to Gloria Steinem. And she was the one who was paired often as the Republican in all the National Women's Political Caucus. And she actually worked in the White House. And she's this wonderful presence within the book because of I talked to her, I managed to track her down through her daughter. And she talked to me for almost 2 hours. And it was this, she gave me so many insights into organizing some of the things she was doing in her kitchen with, people and how they came to pull more and more women in. And if I hadn't found that, I'm not sure I would have been able to put that character and the Aunt Marjorie getting involved in. So I all my research tells me what to do, which it sounds like with you as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, we're very lucky. I mean, to live so close to so many great repositories of information. So I did Library of Congress research, and I went to museums, and I 1917, the centennial for the Night of Terror that we talked about that happened at Occoquan. There were, at least in Fairfax County, were tons of things, like they had like lots of different talks and things that were happening. I went to everything that I could possibly go to. I went to those just to learn information. But then I watch documentaries, and I sometimes read, just to get the lay of the land of, some general information. And then I start to dig in. And I mean, I found this really cool thing about Matilda Young, and because I really didn't know what she did with the National Women's Party, but Library of Congress has the National Women's Party records, and they actually had this cool little, like, typed little piece of index card kind of thing, really small, that had the schedule for Matilda Young and when she was answering the switchboard. And I was that was just such a huge piece of information. It was so small. And who knows, like, if it was just for the month of, like, what was the schedule for her and what were her hours. And so it was enough for me to be like, yes, she was super involved at this point. And so those are the kind of rabbit holes that if you fall down to, you're like, this is the piece of information I needed. I went to Duke because of some of Matilda Young's, Duke University, some of her papers as an adult were there. And so I took a day trip and was just like, I need to be able to see all these. I've contacted different people in different places to get more information. And of course went on some of these self-guided tours. And I also took some around DC, but I felt really lucky to sort of be in a place that there was more of, I have 4 big bins of things in my closet from this book. I tend to get, again, rabbit holes, and that's the fun part. It's the super fun part. It's hard because then you're like, okay, now what can I put in and what can I not? What do I have to leave out? And so much of it helps you develop context.
How do you guys balance like historical accuracy with like telling a good story?
Yeah.
So that's a great question. The question is, how do you balance historical accuracy with telling a good story? Which is, I'd really interested to hear that too.
So I mentioned Hamilton before, and I would say that's kind of about the standard, in terms of, at least for me, it's not accurate. It's not, perfect. And yet it reveals a lot of other truths that more accurate description, like all the different books that you've ever read about the founding fathers, even that term, which was from the Harding administration, actually, but like, they're never fighting. They're agreeing. They're speaking as one. And so while they weren't actually battle rapping, they were fighting with each other at all times. So that sort of stuff, I think that is part of the way to do it. And also you have to be reasonably true to the intent and the characters and what they're really talking about. I actually find it useful to really know 100% what the facts are and then make a conscious decision to divert if it's a matter of like shrinking a timeline or putting 2 people together in a room who wouldn't have actually been together or something like that. But to still have a good grounding of the real truth.
Because one of your characters is a composite character, right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that was kind of an interesting thing. It was originally it was going to be John Muir, because Teddy Roosevelt has this, camping trip, which really did happen out in Yosemite, that ended up changing his mind about a lot of things and led to the creation of the national park system. But he also met a number of other different naturalists along the way, part of that. And then also, honestly, there were some complications with John Muir, as there are with every other character there too. And so I, decided to kind of take some elements of him and mix them up with other people too.
Okay, remember that I said everybody has their own way of doing things. Okay. I make it really hard on myself. I absolutely would not put somebody in a room who is
It's
not
got to be
there.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's because of years and years of having been a journalist that I
Mhm.
just won't do it. So I have to know the weather. I get that right. I was really frustrated in one book because I really, really, really needed my character to run into, oh God, Mr. Give Me Liberty, Patrick Henry. And he was never there when my character was. So I didn't, and I won't. So anything you read in my book, even though I have fictional characters, they are amalgamations. I try to, almost all my characters are in some way or another kind of an everyman representative of a type of person I read about during that time period. it does make it a little bit harder, but that's that I keep too. I, by the way, have a book on Peggy Schuyler. I don't know if you all know the youngest Schuyler sister, taking off of all those things. And she is not any place that I couldn't track down where she was. And if you all think that primary documents are boring, read some Hamilton letters because I was able to track her, for instance, and find out where she was and who she talked to, and that she went out into a snowstorm to go, I think, to make sure that her sister was okay because this rogue was romancing her. He dropped all these little bits of gossip about my little sister, my Peggy, immediately, that I could track her. So
What I have, this is a tricky question because like everyone has different and everyone sort of has a line and every story is sort of, has its own challenges. I chose to do as much as I could I knew I could find. And I had like these timelines. I knew when people were arrested and where they were and that kind of thing. But what I decided to do was where the historical record was, either I couldn't find it or it was silent. I chose to like create things to happen. I'm really clear about it in the back matter. So my back matter, like a lot of reviewers have said, there's extensive back matter with extensive research. And I'm like, yes, because I wanted young people to know what was true and what was, where I had to depart from. Like, here's what we know, and these are the things we know, and then these are the ways that I had to depart from that. So
Well, I think
just
some
try
of
to
the
be honest about
lesser known characters like Matilda are kind of a gift to a fiction writer, right? Because you know a little bit and they're there, but there's enough you don't know that you can creatively fill in the. Well, yeah. Thank you to everybody. Thanks for being here, guys. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
For a second. Okay, before I let them go. Thank you all. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you to our incredible panelists. We're now going to go into I knew I was going to do that. Now we're going to go into our signing line. If you would like to purchase a copy of any author's books, they're upstairs at the register. You can go ahead and do that now.